Hello, and welcome back to the Brain First Parenting Podcast. I'm your host, Eileen Devine, and today we are going to talk about our high priorities that we as parents have related to our kids and how these shape the way that we support them and the way that we raise them, and what is different about evaluating our highest priorities for our kids when we have a child who lives with a brain-based difference. I think it's safe to say that these high priorities that we all have as parents and that we should have are tied directly to our deeply held beliefs and our values about what our kids need to thrive and what they need to become more independent as they move into adulthood. So these high priorities could be things like teaching them how to help out around the house and do certain chores to basically take on increased responsibility. Or it may be priorities that are directly tied to them getting an education and doing well in school. So attending school consistently, doing well while they are there. So academically and socially, behaviorally. Maybe it's following through on homework. Those are just a few examples of priorities that many of us as parents hold for our kids. Another area that I hear a lot about as it relates to these high priorities that we as parents have is making sure that our kids, our child, our teenager, our young adult, that they're taking care of themselves. So things like attending to their personal hygiene regularly and consistently, or their dental care, or getting some level of physical activity, spending time outside, having some limits around screen time. All of these are really common high priorities that we as parents have related to shaping and raising and supporting our kids. There's another area that I hear a lot about, and it's about just being a good person and having meaningful relationships. So treating others with kindness, being a good friend, being a thoughtful sibling. Again, all of these are high priorities for many of the parents that I work with, and very good reason. They come from a place of care and concern for your child who you really want to see grow up into this independent, thoughtful, self-sufficient adult. As parents, we should have these priorities. I think it goes without saying that it's definitely a part of our role, that these high priorities reflect, again, your care, your concern for your child, that you want what's best for them, that you want them to grow, again, in their independence and their ability to have increased responsibility over time. So there's absolutely nothing wrong with holding on tightly to these high priorities. And also, here's what I want to encourage you to think about as a parent of a child or a teen or a young adult with a brain-based difference and often tricky or challenging behavioral symptoms related to all of this. The priorities we hold as parents in relation to our kids, going to school, doing homework, brushing your teeth twice a day, being flexible, being generous in relationships, all of these translate directly into expectations for our kids that require specific cognitive skills. These priorities require their brain. If you've been listening to this podcast for any length of time, you know that this is something that we as parents of kids who have brains that work differently need to always be taking into consideration. Because when you have a child with a brain-based difference, what that means is that their brain doesn't always work as you would expect it to, or as reliably as it needs to keep up with all of those expectations and demands that the world is throwing their way, right? Big or small. Sometimes it's that accumulation of the small expectations and demands that are the biggest driver of those challenging defensive behaviors that we see. Which leads me to another consideration that I believe every parent of a child or teen or young adult with neurobehavioral challenges needs to make. And that is recognizing the cognitive load that is being placed on your child or your teen as a result of them trying to meet all of these high priorities, and taking a step back to really evaluate whether it's a load they can handle. Remember, every task, every expectation that your child is being asked to complete or meet, it's going to add to their cognitive load, which leads to cognitive fatigue, which can lead to behavioral symptoms, and actually then decreases their capacity to do the thing, whatever that thing is. That high priority you so badly want them to move closer to is even further away at that point, when this pattern of cognitive fatigue is set in motion. Cognitive load and cognitive fatigue, it's such an important concept for you as a parent to get clarity on. So if you've not listened to episode 21 yet on this podcast, it's the hidden impact of cognitive fatigue. I will link to it in the show notes, and you can also go listen to it when you're done with this episode so that you can make sure that you're crystal clear on what we're talking about there. Alrighty, so as a parent, what about our experience in all of this? It is sometimes a very hard reality to accept that your child just does not have this capacity or the endurance, the bandwidth to meet every priority that you feel is really reasonable to hold for them. Those seemingly easy to reach goals or priorities. That assumption that it's easy for them is usually because we are basing it on their chronological age, what they should be able to do at their chronological age. And as you know from listening to this podcast, our kids experience uneven development across these cognitive skill domains. So chronological age isn't an accurate measure of whether or not they can handle it or do the thing. So, what does this mean for us as parents? Sometimes it does mean setting aside some of your high priorities because you now recognize that it's just not in the cards for your child or your teen or your young adult right now based on how their brain works. Believe me, I know that it is so hard to hear and even harder to put this into action. It often means that we have to make some hard decisions about what we need to set aside for now and then narrow our focus on a few highest priorities. Those that you decide definitely need to be at the forefront, there may be non-negotiables, so they are going to be the focus of your energy and your attention. But you also recognize now that for your child to meet even those few high priorities, it's going to require a whole lot of them. And that's why we narrow it down to a few. When I say a few, the exact number is going to look different for each child, for each parent, for each home. But what I'll say about that is that most parents I work with are still overestimating their child or their teen's capacity and need to reduce even more when they're trying to find this right balance. So start really small, maybe at a place where you feel even slightly uncomfortable with how much you've narrowed your focus. That's probably actually a pretty good place for you to begin. I think it goes without saying that this is one of those spots in this unique parenting journey that you and I share where easing into the acceptance of what is and who your child is, and then shifting your perspective and expectations can be so tough. There's a lot of internal resistance that bubbles up when we are setting aside priorities that are understandably so important to us so that we can focus on those few highest priorities. So, this is important for all of us to be thinking about and evaluating no matter what's happening in our home. But for those of you who have a child with a high amount of defensive behavioral symptoms in your home right now, so a lot of escalation, a lot of tension, a lot of chaos. It seems like they're constantly on the edge of dysregulation or maybe in dysregulation much of the time. This concept is especially important for you because when I'm working with a parent where that's the current state of their home, this is one of the first things we talk about, and it's taking inventory of their priorities and their expectations for their child, narrowing it way down to a select few. That goal, the goal of doing that, is to provide both the parent and the child with some relief, to bring down the temperature in the home and to allow their nervous system and their child's nervous system to settle. So there's two ways that that process can come about. One is when this evaluation of your highest priorities needs to happen in the moment. So, for example, your high priority, let's say that it's you want them to bathe every day. And this is very important for lots of reasons. You definitely spend a considerable amount of time and energy making sure that they do this on a daily basis. But there's this particular night where your child's school day was especially rough, and you can see they're in a pretty fragile state that particular night. You're seeing more behavioral symptoms than usual. And so you decide in that moment, you know what? Tonight, them bathing, it's not my highest priority. I'm not going to even mention it to them. I'm just going to let it go for tonight. So that's one way that this can look, thinking about it in the moment based on what you're seeing in terms of how symptomatic your child or teen is in that given moment for whatever reason. The other way to go about this is a more systematic and proactive approach. And when I was thinking about this other way to do this, there was one particular client I worked with that came to mind in thinking about this. Now, this is a parent who every day was experiencing World War III level conflict in their home, trying to get their son to go to school. And when I began working with them, their child was going to school very inconsistently, never without a fight. It was never easy. And the school attendance was becoming less consistent over time. And they were understandably terrified that this pattern was leading to full on school refusal. They did not want that to happen. It was clear in talking about the patterns they were seeing that their son woke up each day already experiencing a sense of overwhelm and anxiety, just anticipating going into that environment, the school environment, that was very, very challenging for him. From a brain based perspective, there were not nearly the accommodations in place that he needed. So that was one piece. The parents began working on that with the school. But in the meantime, they wanted him to still be able to make it to school. So this was when we began to take a look at this parent's highest priorities as it related to getting their son out the door and to school in the morning. And when they took inventory of the priorities that they had for their son in this short period of time in the morning, they realized really quickly it was a really heavy load from a cognitive skills standpoint. Those priorities were causing cognitive fatigue and overwhelm in their son before he even left the home. And this was in addition to the stress that was already in his system from anticipating just going into that school environment. So their homework was to narrow down their focus to their top three priorities from that entire list of morning expectations and tasks. That was really hard for them, understandably, but it was necessary in order to get their child to school more consistently. So their priorities were that their son get dressed, that seemed pretty essential, that he eat something for breakfast. They knew that was key to him having a good start to his day, and that he take his medications. Another really important piece to give him more capacity to be in that school environment. So that meant that everything else that they asked him to do in that morning routine, that period of time, was either set aside for now, things like brushing his teeth, putting his own lunch into his backpack, making his bed, checking on his own to be sure he had his own work, taking the bus to school. All of that was either taken off the table completely for now, or the parent did it for him entirely, which was the level of accommodations he needed to be able to focus on those three highest priorities: getting dressed, eating breakfast, and taking medications, so that he had a better chance of having the capacity to meet the highest priority of all, which was get out the door and get to school. This was hard for this parent, putting aside especially the priority of brushing the teeth in the morning. That was a real hard one because dental hygiene was such a high priority for this parent, as it should be. So it didn't mean that they didn't have this expectation any longer. It just meant it wasn't going to happen in the morning, which meant that maybe on some days he didn't brush his teeth twice a day, or maybe he brushed it at a different time of day. But here's the important piece that I reminded this parent of: this isn't forever. It was just until they could get into a more predictable routine of successfully getting to school each day and making sure that their son had some capacity to make it into that environment. So the other piece that was really hard for them was that they totally cut out the bus out of the routine in the morning, because it was a really harsh environment for this child from a sensory integration standpoint, also social standpoint, and it did not set him up for success for the day. And that was a regular concern that he would also voice about why he wasn't going to school that day. So this was definitely inconvenient for these parents, because then they had to drive their son to school, which was disruptive to their day and getting their work day started. So I'm definitely aware of how hard and inconvenient and disruptive it can be to put in place what I'm suggesting, um, and do this day to day. But here's the thing: if I didn't speak about this and encourage you to evaluate those high priorities that you hold for your child or your teen from this brain first perspective, that would be setting you up for failure and more resentment. It would only lead to more burnout as a parent, and actually burnout for your child too. So, my encouragement to you is to spend some time talking about the different parts of your child's day, thinking about the different parts of your child's day, especially the tricky ones, those ones where you see a lot of behavioral symptoms, and taking a look at the high priorities that you are holding on to for dear life. And from there, spend some time thinking about what it might feel like to, from that list, pick your highest priorities, maybe two or three to begin, and focus your energy, your accommodations, and your efforts on those highest priorities, giving yourself permission to set aside those others for now until your child has more capacity. Maybe when they are less symptomatic, meaning experiencing the less of those defensive, challenging behaviors. You deserve to have more ease and relief in your day, and honestly, so do they. This is one way to move closer to that for both of you. Thanks as always for listening, and until next time, take care.